everyone, and welcome to our Friday tour. My name is Gisela Carbonell. I am the curator of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum here at Rollins College, and I am delighted to be with you this morning to tour a very special exhibition we have on view at the museum, Pushing the Envelope, Mail Art from the Archives of American Art. Before we get started, I would love to hear where you're watching from, where you're joining us from, and if you have had a chance to see the exhibition. If you haven't, the museum is open, so I will give you some information at the end of the tour on how you can engage with the exhibition in person and virtually if you're interested. So today we're going to be talking about a special exhibition that includes very special materials that we have on view here for couple more weeks until the end of this month. This is an exhibition that was curated by Dr. Miriam Kinley, who is a professor of art history at the University of Kentucky. This is a project that Dr. Kinley worked with her students in her special topics seminar on the international mail art movement. And it started with an interest in correspondence art, researching primary materials, and eventually organizing this exhibition that has been on view at 3 venues. We are the 3rd venue for the exhibition. So before we dive into how the exhibition came about and what are some of the materials, I'm going to highlight some of the objects that are included in this exhibition. I want to acknowledge the support for this program from Art Bridges, and particularly acknowledge and thank the Pabst Steinmetz Foundation for their support for this exhibition as well. So I mentioned that the exhibition started as part of a seminar on correspondence art at the University of Kentucky. So this is part of a student-faculty collaboration, which we thought was a great fit for us here at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum and following and aligned with our teaching mission. So a couple of things that are fascinating in terms of how the exhibition came about. Dr. Kinley started researching artists who engage in correspondence art or who have created works and use the Postal Service as a means to communicate and create collaboration networks for artists to exchange works of art and also to reach curators and people in the art world to say something about art making and about traditional modes of display. And so with her students, they engaged the Archives of American Art, which is of course a part of the Smithsonian institution. And the archives has been collecting, preserving, and documenting objects, letters, photographs, diaries, manuscripts that trace the history of visual arts in America. So it's a very rich archive. It holds more than 20 million pieces or objects in its collection. So there was a lot of material for Dr. Kinley and her students to work with. And if you're interested in hearing more specifically about what the students in the class did and how they approached the research for these exhibition and all of these objects, she gave us a lecture about her research and her process. She's a specialist in mail art, particularly in the work of Ray Johnson. So that is on our YouTube page, and you can go and watch the lecture if you want to know more about that. So the exhibition was on view at the Gallery of the Archives of American Art and later at the University of Kentucky, and now it's here at Rollins, and this is the last venue that I know of for the showing of the exhibition. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what it means, correspondence art or mail art, but I just wanted to point to this map that one of Dr. Kinley's students put together to trace the network that these artists created who participated in the mail art movement, because this is a movement or an exchange that included and includes artists from different parts of the world. And that's really an important part of the history of mail art, is how global in scope it is, and also having attachments to certain communities and certain locations specifically that we will look at in a second. If you have questions or comments, just feel free to put them in the comment box, and hopefully we can get to all of them at the end of the exhibition tour. There are three main themes addressed in this exhibition: circulation, collaboration, and community. Those are evident in the works produced that we have in the exhibition, and I'm showing you a few of the views of how the objects are displayed in the galleries. This is an exhibition that doesn't have the traditional paintings hanging on the walls. There are a lot of postcards and works on paper, cards, letters, different types of pieces of print and mail that have been intervened, in some cases by many artists, in some cases by one or two, and then a couple of uncommon objects when we think about things that are that can be mailed, that we will look at in a second. And so the exhibition is organized in several sections: media matters, global networks, alternative art worlds, political dissent, queer correspondence, and local scenes. Okay, so the mail art movement, or again, this exchange between artists using the postal system as a way to connect with each other, and as an alternative means of producing and distributing and receiving art, started during the 1950s and 60s. And as we will see, as I mentioned, they exchanged letters, postcards, and other materials that challenge definitions of what can be art, or and also challenge definitions of what it can be considered correspondence or mail art. These artists also, and this is also a common thread throughout the selection of works in the show, these artists question the art market, and also elite traditional art institutions, meaning galleries and museums. A lot of them question who gets to make the decisions in terms of who are the artists that are shown in certain institutions, and what works and why. And so for many of these artists, even though some of them participated in exhibitions in prestigious museums and maybe their works were sold in galleries, they were creating spaces using the Postal Service for them to have exchanges that were free from the criteria that we use in museums and in galleries, or the judgment, or the requirement for traditional institutions to select work and include them in exhibitions. So a lot of these artists created their own rules, and in many cases, those were create a piece of art, send it to another artist, have that artist intervene it, add to it, change it. And then in some cases, add instructions for that artist to forward it to yet another person. And that way expand the network and create more contacts of people who wanted to create and exchange ideas without being limited by rules or requirements, institutional rules and requirements. So here we have a few examples from the Media Matters section of the exhibition. And these are some of the works that I find so fascinating as objects, but also because of what they say about these artists and their objectives. So many artists who engage with these types of exchanges wanted to work and disseminate their works and their statements outside of the art market. For some of them also, it was important to use this method because they were maybe living in countries where their art making and their statements could be censored by the government, or maybe they would be subjected to major consequences. So for a lot of these artists, creating work that was exchanged and disseminated using the Postal Service also pushed the limits of what art can be and what can be considered art. So those definitions, those traditional conventions in the art world were at the forefront for many of them. And often they use unexpected materials, as I mentioned at the beginning. And so here we have this drawing by Fletcher Cobb and Ken Friedman. And this is the Suck of the Month. This is from 1970. And what you see here, you can see it on the image on the left, also in the display case in the gallery, is precisely a sock. It's an actual sock that these artists used to create a parody of subscription clubs. So particularly, they talk about how monthly club subscriptions, like Cheese of the Month Club, for instance, were things that were intended to appeal to a certain sector of society, to certain kinds of people that show good taste and sophistication. And so these artists, humorously, but making a statement about social divisions and social class differences, and especially in the art world, said, okay, well, why don't we create a Sock of the Month Club where we're going to wear these socks and get paint all over them, and then we're going to mail that, and that will be our subscription club. It's not going to be anything sophisticated or expected, like cheese or wine or anything like that. And so some of these objects were sent to other artists. In this case, this one was sent to Lucy Lepard, a curator and art critic who sometimes engaged in this in these exchanges with the artist. And on the right, we have a work by Leonard Tawney that includes feathers and some tactile elements. And so it's interesting to think about how these objects, these works, were meant to be touched, handled, exchanged, mailed. And if they were, folded or torn, that was okay. They were not meant to be as works of art to be shown framed in a museum gallery on the wall in the traditional way. So I wonder what some of these artists, what their perception of these exhibitions could be now that we look at these works in a different way and put them in context so that we can study them and learn more about the mail art movement. So very different from the works that we would expect at that time to see. The work on the left, on the bottom left on the screen, by Ria Nikonova, a Russian artist who created this piece of mail with a "Do Not Open" sign, something that may seem common and maybe a little bit humorous, with the hand there trying to go maybe and open the envelope. But for Nikonova, who lived in Russia and had limitations on her creation and her dissemination of her work prior to 1989, opening an envelope that contained mail art could mean censorship, could mean a certain kind of punishment for her or for any artist who engaged in that type of art making, because it was not a type of art that was authorized by the government. It was not an official approved art. And so it had those limitations. So here, the Postal Service or the postal system allowed her to exchange these types of images and pieces of paper with her thoughts and her creations with artists in other countries that lived under different conditions. In the global networks section, there's this very interesting piece that you see here on the right by a Japanese artist, Ryosuke Koen. And this is a project that is still going, and it's fascinating to think about all the artists that have been engaged in this project that the artist called the Brain Cell Project. and it started in 1985, and it's still going. And so here you have artists making an effort to connect with artists, intentionally connect with artists who are in other parts of the world. And in this case, with very specific instructions. So Cohen would would get started with a piece of paper with stickers or rubber stamps, as you see here, and they would send it to another artist with a list of names and addresses, and that's what you see on the right. So on the back of the sheet, there would be names and addresses of other artists in other countries, so that you would add to the work your own stamps or your own stickers, your own drawings, and then reproduce it and send it to those artists who are on the list, and that way expand the network and participate with other artists. And yes, a lot of times they didn't meet in person, so there are many of these artists who knew each other through the exchange of artwork, through receiving a piece of mail and seeing what another person in another country had created, and then passing it along to someone else to continue doing it that way. That doesn't mean that they didn't meet in person. Some of the artists we're going to talk about in the local connection section did know each other, especially in some cities here in the US, but this global network meant that there were people all over the world engaging in these projects. And this one in particular has now more than 6,000 artists who have participated in the Brain Cell Project. And so it's interesting to think about how the extent of the system to connect all these artists that otherwise would not have connected in the traditional mainstream art world way of showing art. And so I don't know about you, but to me, this resonates today when we are meeting here on a Facebook live stream or on Zoom, and maybe connecting with people who, if we were not using this technology, may not be necessarily making the effort to travel or having the resources or the means or the time to travel to places far away to meet and have a conversation about art. But technology is allowing us to do that and bring together people from a lot of different places and contexts. So there's kind of a parallel there. It's not the same, of course, but it's making me think of ways in which we use the resources that we have to connect with others to address themes and things that are of mutual interest. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the objectives of some of these artists was to find ways to maybe say something about the art world, and in a way speak to, in some cases, the bureaucratic process that some artists felt museums engage in, in the process to organize an exhibition, or in the process of receiving submissions from artists, and then the selection process to curate group exhibitions. So just the process of how it works traditionally in the art world. And so some of these artists, Ray Johnson, who was one of the earliest, if not the earliest artist to get started with mail art, but also others who use, even in this case, and this is what I'm showing you here, loan agreements for exhibitions or correspondence with museum registrars or curators and museum officials as a way to intervene those documents and say, okay, this is my art, this is what I am creating, to say something about the process, right? So it's almost circumventing, but also subverting some of the structures that are in place in the art world to interact with artists and other curators and create exhibitions. And so this one that I'm showing you, one of the ones that I'm showing you here, Ray Johnson mailed a letter to a curator at the Whitney with instructions for the curator to please forward that letter again to Lucy Lippard. And then Lucy Lippard, who sometimes engaged with these artists in these exchanges, here responded to Ray Johnson's letter. And she says, this is the quote that's here on the right. She says, responding to Ray Johnson, sometimes I followed your instructions and dutifully forwarded esoteric around the city or the block or the world. Other times I was opposed to doing what I was told. I've always had an authority problem. In any case, Ray, you are an original, and now there are too many quick to copy. You have quite a few debts to pay to society, having introduced male art, sexist, and encouraged the birth of the conceptual mutant and mystified the post office and dematerialized materialism. So it's ways of engaging here, not only with other artists, but in this case, including museum professionals, curators, registrars, art critics, in a way that is different than maybe engaging during a lecture in the museum gallery, right? So this is a whole different system of engagement that uses the same avenues that are in place, or the same structures that are in place to critique them, right? To draw attention to them. And in this case, George Brecht and other artists sometimes would send letters and say, well, here's, you asked me to fill out the loan agreement, but I'm not sending you the loan agreement. I'm sending you, this letter with a piece of a ticket stub, and please send this to Ray Johnson. And so again, having the people who work at the museum become artistic agents themselves and engaging in this process. And some of them making very specific statements about the art world. You have here a work by Schneck here on the left that says male art is not museum art. I don't know if you recognize the building that looks like it's going in the trash there. It looks like it's the old Whitney Museum building, now the Met Breuer in New York. Male art is disposable art. Use it, abuse it, don't file it. And then on the right there, it says shred it, wrap fish in it. So basically saying in very direct terms that this is not meant to be framed and shown in a museum. It's meant to be, used and exchanged. And if it gets torn, it gets torn. If it gets stained, it gets stained. So it doesn't, the rules that we apply to paintings or traditional sculptures do not apply here. That's what the artist is saying, right? We are rewriting the rules for our works, and that means that there are no rules, right? You can use this art for whatever you want, or however you think it's best. On the right, another piece of mail from Ray Johnson to, again, Lucy Lippard. In this case, a work that it creates a cutout for the mouth area, so creating a face, so of course very humorous. And then at the bottom there are two small photographs showing how to use it. On the left it says face collage by Ray Johnson, but on the right it says fake collage by Ray Johnson. So again, ways of questioning the definitions of art, and questioning also who gets to make those decisions. What qualifies as art? Is it important that art, when we talk about art, there is one original, unique piece of art, or is art something that should be accessible and physically accessible to everyone, as is the case with male art? So these are some of the questions that they are bringing up. Other artists take a little bit more serious tone to make statements about politics and social issues. These are works by Clemente Palin, artist from Uruguay, who use male art to denounce injustice, not only in South America, but in other parts of the world. And you see here pieces of mail art he created denouncing apartheid in Africa and the US blockade to Cuba, and also dictatorships in Central and South America, and the intervention and presence of the US military in some of these regions. Padin in particular was censored for his views. He was imprisoned, and it was through the mail that he was able to get some of these points across to others who lived in other places. In the case of Ria Nikonova, who we talked about earlier, while she was in the Soviet Union, she was invited to, or received a notice that there was a symposium of mail art in Japan from her counterpart or friend, John Held Jr. in the US. And she received the invitation, but she was not allowed to go. She didn't have permission to leave and participate in that symposium. So she sent him this piece of mail with this drawing saying, I cannot, right? And her name and USSR at the top of her speech bubble. But if you look closely at the figures, it looks like he's extending his arms to her, trying to reach her and maybe embrace her. And she has a rope around her neck, and there's a tiny little hand there that's pulling on that rope to the side of the USSR. So of course, images that have a lot of implications in terms of the political climate at that time, and also how that intersects with artistic activity, right? Her artistic practice and career were limited because of the situation and the context in which she lived. So I think it's amazing that we have these pieces of mail that have been preserved and that we are able to learn more and know more about these artist stories through these pieces of mail. So for a lot of them, this was a way to make evidence and denounce their lack of autonomy and lack of freedom in their art making, and serve, this function today to talk about how artists, experience censorship and how those may or may not be challenged today. What is different today in different parts of the world? Other artists who use the postal system to create networks are featured in the exhibition here in the section of queer correspondence. And here we have these pieces of mail art by Le Petit Bonbon, also sent to Lucy Lippard in the 1970s. Members of the band who lived in Wisconsin and eventually moved to LA and created and found a collective and community there in the 1970s and had these invitations sent to Lucy Lippard. The work on the left, also at the bottom left, by artists who also challenged the narrative about gender and sexuality and how it appeared in the media during these time, 1970s and early 1980s. And so artists who created here postcards, in this case, that pushed the limits of what was considered decent at the time to be shown in the media or to be shown in public. So there's a lot of social issues that are brought up in the creation of these works and the circulation of these works. And I talked a little bit earlier about the global extent of the mail art movement, but that in some cases mail art was used to try to create community in specific places. And this is the case with some of the examples I'm going to show in this slide and in the next one, where we have artists who use mail art to create somewhat underground, although I don't know if that's the right term, but maybe create networks and communities that were outside of the mainstream art world in that time and in those locations, and also to promote local events that they were engaged in so that other artists and other people would know about them. That's the case with the artist stamps that we see here on the lower left, representing some of the other artists, and then on the right, Canadian artist Anna Banana, creating performances, and then cards, everything about bananas. In some cases sent again to Lucy Lippard and others. Banana cards, I think they were called, and even Banana Olympics. And artists who, we have looked at a few works by Ray Johnson, but here, Sergei here, who is also promoting with this piece of mail, promoting the first mail art exhibition that occurred in Russia. This was Ria Nikonova's husband that we looked at earlier. And so here, making a statement against official art, represented here by this little ant that it's about to be crushed. And then on the right, we have an invitation to a meeting of male artists, this one by Ray Johnson. So it's creating an opportunity in New York for male artists to meet face to face. And these invitations were sent to one person with instructions on how to or who to send it to next, or finding people to expand the network and have meetings in person. So that gives you an idea of the reach of the mail art movement. And here's a summary of some of the works that we have looked at today. And I think for us to have these works in the galleries, it really allows us an opportunity to learn about this type of work and learn about how these artists use their creativity and use their resources that they had in different contexts and parts of the world to reach each other, right? To exchange ideas, sometimes using humor, sometimes very seriously, alluding to important and serious issues, but nonetheless finding connection, collaboration, and a network to support each other. And so I would love to hear what you have to say, your comments, if you have any questions. If you use the Postal Service for mailing letters, handwritten letters or postcards, I know with so much email and technology, sometimes we don't send as many handwritten letters anymore, but I wonder if that's your case. I know it's exciting to receive handwritten letters and postcards and special stamps. So what are some of the ways that you can engage with this exhibition beyond this exhibition tour? You can visit our website at rollins.edu/CFAM. You can take a virtual 360 tour of the exhibition. If you want to look in more detail from home, you can follow us on social media, of course, at CFAM Rollins, and you can visit us in person. You can reserve your free time ticket on our website and come see the exhibition in person and take some time and look in more detail. So that is our exhibition